Today we're going to talk about ferret nutrition, specifically dry food kibble. Now we'll look at what's good, what's not so good, and we'll bust a few myths and misconceptions along the way. At the end of the video, we'll help you identify what to look for in a good quality kibble versus a not so good quality kibble. So let's get to it. There's lots of advice and opinion out there on how to feed ferrets, but it's not always fully explained or given in the right context. In this video, we're going to focus on commercial dry food kibbles, and in a later video, we'll look at raw food diets. In the last decade or so, there's been increasing focus on what we feed our pets. More than ever, pet owners are looking at the contents of their food and asking questions such as, what are these non-meat products? What are these low-quality products? And why so many additives? It's no surprise that this coincides with the rise of social media. This leads to an abundance of conflicting and often opinion-based information on the internet. As a result, the internet is rife with myths and misconceptions about dry food kibble. So we hope to enhance your understanding about ferrets' nutrition and how it absorbs nutrients into the body. And hopefully, therefore, you can make informed choices on commercial dry food kibble. To avoid being just another source of speculative personal information, we've provided a long list of expert studies, journals, and publications in the description below, which supports each and every one of the facts that I intend to make in this video. If you start Googling ferret nutrition, the first thing you're going to come across is that a ferret is an obligate carnivore. Now, this is a very misunderstood and misused term. Obligate carnivore means that a ferret can obtain all of its nutrients from eating meat. What it does not mean is that a ferret cannot obtain nutrients from eating plant matter. This is an important distinction, and we'll go through this more in the video. Before we go to the specifics of kibble diets, we need to understand exactly how a ferret absorbs and uses nutrients within its body. Digestion is a process of transforming food in its original form into ever smaller particles such that it can eventually be absorbed through the gut into the bloodstream. You're probably used to seeing nutrients displayed in terms of fat, carbohydrate, and protein, but these are all particles too big to pass through the gut into the bloodstream. The body, therefore, digests these further into ever smaller particles in order to get through into the blood. This means breaking protein down into amino acids, fats break down into fatty acids and glycerol, and carbohydrates break down into glucose. A protein is a very specific compound, unique to the source from which it was obtained, be that animal or plant. But once it's broken down into amino acids, there is no difference. A glycine amino acid is just a glycine amino acid, regardless of whether it was obtained from a plant or from an animal. And this is why nutritional experts often refer to animals having requirements for nutrients and not requirements for ingredients. So the question you might then ask is, if you can get amino acids from plant matter or from animal matter, then does it matter which? Well, the answer is yes, it does. The quality of a protein is assessed in terms of the amount of amino acids it produces and the ease of digestion of that protein into those amino acids. Animal proteins almost universally break down into more amino acids than plant proteins. Further, meat contains more protein per gram than plant food. This means to get the same amount of proteins from plant matter than meat, you'd have to eat a lot more by volume of plant matter than you would of meat. As you'd expect, carnivores are perfectly adapted to breaking down meat into amino acids. Different meats contain different proportions of different amino acids, but in general, all meats contain all of the essential amino acids required by the body. Studies have looked at the ease and efficiency of digesting plant food by carnivores such as ferrets and cats, and these studies identify that so long as the plant food is provided in the appropriate cooked and processed form, the contents are highly digestible by the carnivores. In fact, a respected critical care food manufacturer, Emerade, provides a critical care food for carnivores, which is exclusively made out of plant food. This is based on its high digestibility. Now, these findings might come as a bit of a surprise. After all, the most common argument on the internet against carnivores and plant matter is carnivores can't digest cellulose. And this is true, but it's somewhat of an irrelevance, and we'll discuss that in a minute. The inner contents of both plant and animal cells are equally a set of proteins, water, and sugar, but the plant cells have a rigid cell wall made out of cellulose, whereas animal cells do not. Cellulose is very difficult to digest, so much so that no member of the animal kingdom can, on its own, digest cellulose. Herbivores do have large areas of their digestive tract, such as the cecum and the rumen, where cellulose is broken down. But this is not done by the animal itself. This is done by large colonies of bacteria that the animal has obtained from the external environment. Whilst carnivores do possess some of this bacteria in their intestines, it is not in sufficient quantities to digest cellulose efficiently. So if carnivores can't digest cellulose, how do they access the proteins within the plant cells? Thanks to the intervention from humans, plant matter can be made available to the carnivores. Processes which enable carnivores to access these nutrients include cooking the plant matter destroys the integrity of the plant cell walls. Physical extraction, such as grinding or blending, can also destroy the cell walls to some extent, as well as chemical extraction using enzymes or acids and alkalis to extract the nutrients. All of these processes exist to some extent in the dry food extrusion process, which makes the plant matter in dry kibble quite a different proposition for ferrets than it would be plant matter in the wild. Okay, so let's summarise what we've discussed this far by identifying what defines a good quality kibble versus a not so good quality kibble. Well, the first thing to look for is a high protein content in the kibble. As fat and moisture and ash and fibre contents don't tend to vary too much, a high protein is likely to come hand in hand with a low carbohydrate content. Whilst we've discussed that ferrets can't technically digest these carbohydrate nutrients, it's more efficient for a ferret to get its energy from fats and protein than it is from carbohydrates. Now, this doesn't mean you need crazy high protein content. If we look at wild prey, a mouse is typically around 55% protein on a dry matter basis. However, most studies seem to suggest to aim for around 30 to 40% protein. In fact, those same studies suggest that senior ferrets, older than 4 years old, would benefit from a slightly lower protein content to avoid kidney issues and strain. The advice is also to try and aim for more protein from meat products than from plant products. Whilst the plant products are digestible, there are more amino acids from meat than there are from plants, so meat is best. Protein mix from meat and plant is not going to be shown on the packet, but it's not a particularly difficult test. Plant-based protein comes hand in hand with carbohydrates. So if you were to increase the overall proportion of protein, which is from plants, you would increase the overall proportion of carbohydrates in the food and thus lowering the total protein content. The higher the total protein content on the label, the higher proportion of that comes from animals than from plants. That is, unless they have a specific ingredient which refers to a vegetable protein, such as corn protein or potato protein, then it becomes a lot more difficult to identify. While such plant protein isolates are considered up and coming, there's very little scientific study that's been done on the impact of ferret nutrition of those proteins. Whilst we don't consider this plant protein product to be feared as such, pet owners may want to pay closer attention to the other ingredients on the list when considering the overall quality of that product. Meat is very high in protein and fat, and very low in carbohydrate. This leads some observers to suggest that ferrets cannot digest carbohydrate, but this is not true. Studies suggest that properly cooked and processed carbohydrates within pet foods are easily digestible by ferrets, both in their sugars and starch form, although this digestibility may be limited to around 60 or 70% of the volume. Although interesting to note that whilst carbohydrate doesn't exist in meat, it does exist in whole prey, by virtue of the contents of its stomach. A mouse, for example, is perhaps 8% carbohydrate in total. There are valid concerns in the public and scientific communities as to whether the additional energy provided by carbohydrates can contribute to illnesses such as diabetes, obesity, or other insulin-based sicknesses. Ferrets are not often the subject of such studies, more often cats and dogs, mink and the like, and so caution should be exercised when judging the output of those studies and their relevance to the ferrets. In particular, ferrets have a much shorter digestive tract than cats, which means that the impact of carbohydrates might be experienced to a much lesser extent in ferrets than in cats. Nevertheless, there have been many different studies on many different species covering many different angles of the impact of carbohydrates on pet health, but as yet there is no scientific evidence to confirm that relatively moderate or low levels of carbohydrate poses any material health risk to ferrets. Rather, most studies seem to suggest that low levels of carbohydrate in commercial foods, around 20 to 30%, are well tolerated by ferrets. We've already covered that the plant food content of kibble is technically digestible by ferrets, but as ferrets don't have a dietary requirement for anything that a plant gives, then the question might be, why put plant matter in there at all? Well, the answer is that the plant matter is in there almost exclusively for the purpose of binding the meat into kibble pieces. Without the starch that those vegetables provide, the kibble wouldn't form into solid pieces and would crumble. Now, as we've explained before, ferrets will be able to use the nutrients within those plant foods. It's just they're not technically required. Plant ingredients are cheaper than meat ingredients, which means that cheaper kibbles are likely to have a higher plant content in order to meet the protein quota. Ferrets tend to be more efficient at digesting fat than other carnivores such as cats. For this reason, a higher fat content, around 20%, is recommended for ferret food. In many carnivore species, fibre is largely undigested, although it does ferment in the large intestine by bacteria, and these release additional nutrients as well as play a role in the overall biohealth of the animal. However, ferrets have a very short digestive tract of around 3 hours, and studies have shown that they possess very little bacterial activity in the intestines. Therefore, fibre does not play the same role for ferrets as it may do in other carnivores. In the US, there seems to have been a marketing-driven move towards the inclusion of probiotics in animal foods. This seems to have been based on the significant benefits that probiotics do deliver to humans and other animal species, although the speed of transit and the low bacterial activity in ferrets means there's very little scientific evidence to suggest that probiotics are of benefit to ferrets. Fibre can still, however, be considered to provide a mechanical purpose. For example, the roughage helps clear out the system on its way through. In the wild, this action is performed to some extent by the undigested fibre in the gut of the prey animal, which studies suggest is around 2% of the animal in total, and also by undigested fur and beaks and feathers from that prey animal. So fibre should be kept to a bare minimum, ideally around 2%, similar to wild prey. The remaining items in the nutritional analysis tables are moisture and ash. These don't really play a role in the assessment of quality, but moisture tends to be around about 9% and ash tends to be around about 7%. Whilst ferrets do have a medical requirement for certain vitamins and minerals, the exact nature of the minimum requirements for ferrets is not yet known. Foods typically are based on the known requirements for other species such as cats or mink. Not only do we need to include certain vitamins and minerals within a ferret's diet, we also need to pay careful consideration to the relationships between some of those vitamins and minerals. For example, the calcium and phosphorus ratio is considered generally to be optimally around 1.5 to 1 to 2 to 1 calcium to phosphorus parts. A higher fat content will require a higher vitamin E content, and a higher calcium content will require a higher vitamin D content. Whilst there are many of these considerations, a big win for dry food kibble is that this is all considered and included within the diet already. Indeed, excessive supplementation to this already well-balanced mineral and vitamin content may cause unexpected problems. Veterinary publications do suggest that the content of dry food kibble in terms of vitamins and minerals come in well beyond that which is required for a healthy animal. Vitamin and mineral imbalance is a serious condition, though, in homemade diets, and we'll cover that in more detail in the raw meat video. Taurine is an amino acid supporting many health and neurological functions. Cats can't synthesize taurine and have presented significant health issues when fed a diet deficient in taurine. This has led to a significant focus on taurine supplementation within pet food. It's not known for sure whether taurine is an essential amino acid for ferrets, and the taurine deficiency symptoms that observed in cats have not presented in ferrets. But it would be safe to assume, in the absence of conclusive scientific information, that supplementation of taurine should exist for ferrets too. There's little risk in this, as taurine in excessive levels is just excreted in the urine. Guidance for cats is for around 1% taurine content, so ferret owners may wish to look for similar content in their kibble. Most UK and European kibbles do contain around 1 to 2% taurine, although in the US, for some reason, it's markedly lower, at around a tenth of that at 0.1 to 0.2%. Let's now address some of the other concerns that pet owners have about dry food kibble. In the UK and Europe, the human and pet food chains start in the same place, at the slaughterhouse. The same animals, which go into animal feed, also go into the human feed. Animals can only enter the slaughterhouse if they are deemed to pass inspection and are healthy and alive at entry to the slaughterhouse. This means that all meat used in the pet food is of human grade, Any 4D, such as dead, diseased, dying, or disabled animal, will not make it through into the slaughterhouse and must be incinerated. In the US, similar legislation exists in terms of the quality of the animal that enters the slaughterhouse, although it does seem, for some reason, to be slightly less well enforced over there than it is in the UK and Europe. It is thought that USDA-inspected premises are more likely to have stricter controls on the animals which they bring in. The US pet owners may want to look into the background of their pet kibble, although we appreciate this is not going to be an easy task. The modern Western human has developed a wasteful and irrational view as to what a prime edible cut of meat is. We like to see nice, aesthetic whole cuts of muscle meat free of any skin, bone or fat. And unfortunately, we retain these views when we consider what's a good quality meat for our pets. This leads some pet owners to consider what goes into pet food to be a poor quality meat. Whilst the meat that goes into pet food might not be visually appealing from a human perspective, those carcasses, flesh scraps, heads, eyes, tongues, hearts, livers, skin is all excellent protein sources for a ferret. As we discussed before, ferrets have a requirement for nutrients and not a requirement for ingredients. And all of these contents have come from animals which are deemed acceptable for human consumption anyway. There are some parts of the animal which are high protein but not that well digested, and therefore their protein is not made available for the ferret to use. This could involve feathers and hooves and beaks and some connective tissues. But these are all things that ferrets would eat in the wild, so their inclusion is not a problem per se. It just becomes a problem if too much of that content is used instead of digestible protein content. Most studies on dry food digestibility shows that protein is quite highly digested, and therefore it does seem to suggest that use of such undigestible proteins is in low use. And as always, you get what you pay for, and you would expect the lower quality kibbles to make greater use of this cheaper product than the higher quality kibble. Opponents of dry food kibble often refer to nutrients being destroyed during the cooking process, but this is a bit vague and too definitive. Whilst it is true that certain vitamins and proteins are sensitive to heat, studies have shown that the relatively high moisture content, the high speed of the cooking process, and the low cooking temperatures do tend to preserve the nutritional content of the output. Losses experienced during the extrusion process are allowed for by upping the content pre-cooking in order to get the desired nutritional mix at the end of the cooking process. The extrusion process is almost 100 years old and is very well researched and understood. The exact conditions of the temperature of the cooking, the speed of the flow, the pressure involved in the cooking are all finely tuned to deliver the specific output required by each manufacturer. It's not simply a case of throwing in all the ingredients and hoping for the best. Another concern often expressed by pet owners is the sheer volume of additives which are visible at the end of the ingredients list. Now, many of these are just the scientific names for the vitamins and minerals, so they're not to be afraid of. And generally speaking, the trace amounts of fruit and vegetables at the end are there typically for vitamin and mineral content as opposed to bulk. What pet owners should be rightfully wary of is the existence of artificial sweeteners, flavours, colourings or preservatives. Certain artificial preservatives such as BHA, BHT and ethoxyquin have been linked with health conditions and cancer, although arguments in their favour refer to risk being a factor of dosage, and the dosage in the dry food kibble is extremely low. But risk is still risk, right? And there are natural preservatives available instead. Luckily, at least in the UK and Europe, ethoxyquin is currently banned in pet foods on account of its health risks. You might find it difficult to identify exactly when an artificial preservative has been used. Manufacturers are only required to put on their ingredients list those items which they add themselves. Certain artificial preservatives could come already built into the meal that they obtain from other suppliers, and therefore manufacturer could easily put on their contents that there are no added artificial preservatives, but that does not mean that there are no artificial preservatives in the entire product. It just means that they did not add them themselves. What pet owners should probably look for is a statement of no artificial colours, flavours or preservatives, rather than no added artificial colours, flavours or preservatives. In terms of water, some observers have concerns that dry food diets lead to dehydration issues. Some species, such as cats, are typically quite poor at taking in water separate from their food. This is not a problem for ferrets, however. They're quite happy drinking from a water bowl to make up any shortages that they might have in moisture content from a dry food kibble diet. Grain-free products started to boom in popularity around a decade or so ago, and this was driven by strong marketing along the lines of three perceived issues. Firstly, that pets are allergic to grains. The studies suggest only around 5% of cats are allergic to wheat gluten, which is coincidentally the same amount of cats which are allergic to chicken, and certainly much less than those which are allergic to beef products. Secondly, that grain products are not a natural part of the carnivore's diet, which is true, but as we've covered before, it's not a problem per se, and those grains have just been replaced by other vegetable matters anyway, so this is not a particular benefit for grain-free products. And thirdly, that poor quality grain was used in the products, which is not factually correct, and even if it were, it sort of conflicts with the second point, in that if grains are not of use to a ferret, then what does it matter what quality those grains are? In essence, those marketing provocations are pretty much a non-event, which means that grain-free diets are not necessarily any better than grain-included diets. That is, unless your ferret does actually have a wheat intolerance. However, the term grain-free has become synonymous with a better quality product, and therefore, in order to just these higher prices they charge for the products, they tend to include better quality meat ingredients as well. Therefore, those grain-free products may end up being a better quality product in total, but not by virtue of it being grain-free. In the wild, ferrets eat about 8 to 10 meals a day, and providing a permanent supply of kibble in a bowl helps a ferret maintain this optimal way of feeding, as opposed to, say, a diet which provides food only once or twice a day. This is of particular interest when you have a larger group of ferrets, which may have individuals with different feeding habits or preferences. Whilst talking of kibble, another big win is the sterility of the product. The heat and cooking part of the extrusion process destroys harmful bacteria, and thus avoiding some of the serious problems that can arise when humans handle and ferrets eat raw meat products. Again, this will be covered in more detail in the raw meat video. There are two types of dental issue when considering kibble diets. The first is the wearing down of teeth. The ferret's teeth have evolved to efficiently chew up whole prey animals. Their teeth are therefore sharp-edged, designed for cutting and shearing meat rather than flat-faced for grinding like our human molars. Kibble is formed of relatively hard pieces, so ferrets need to crunch these up into small pieces before they can swallow them. This crunching of the hard material wears the teeth down. Wearing of teeth can cause pain and complications in later life, especially when you expose the inner soft pulp of the tooth. But not all kibble is created equal. You can see here a collection of 4 different kibbles. Not only are they different in size, but they are also different in density and hardness. There is a big difference between the size of the largest kibble and the smallest. A ferret would therefore have to make many more bites if eating the larger kibble than the smaller kibble. The more bites, the more wear on the teeth. So it's advisable to seek a kibble with smaller pieces if possible. However, size is not everything. The next smallest kibble is a good small size, but is much denser and harder than the others. This means that the ferret would need much more force to crunch the kibble, and more force means more wear on the teeth. Again, the smallest kibble wins in this area too. Not only is it small, but its thin shape means it breaks apart with relative ease compared to the others. Owners should therefore consider the shape, size and density of the kibble options available to them. The second dental issue is the build-up of plaque or calculus on the teeth. Calculus will form on the teeth over time with any type of food. The only way that it is controlled is by physical abrasion. In the wild, the physical act of chewing up the animal prey will scrub away the plaque and therefore avoid calculus build-up on the teeth. This scrubbing action does not exist with kibbles, as the kibble simply breaks apart with the first pressure from the teeth. Of course, calculus will also build up on wet or raw food diets if the diet is provided in a blended form, as there is no significant chewing or scrubbing action performed there either. So what's the takeaway here? Well, myths and misconceptions have fostered an unnecessary fear as kibble as a whole, and the entire food category has been tarnished by the actions of the few cheaper kibble manufacturers. In simple terms, you get what you pay for. Quality ingredients cost money. If you buy a bottom dollar ferret kibble, you're likely to have a product which promotes a healthy ferret. But the better quality kibbles are perfectly capable of providing a ferret with all of its nutritional requirements. Thanks for watching. If you did like the video, please like and subscribe, and try out some of our other videos.